Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Victory Road World Cup presented by Elgato. I'm Sierra Hunter, joined with Jamie Boyd. Jamie, how's it been today? I heard the last match was something.
That was a great last match between Peru and France there. A good showing from the Mammoth in that second game as well. A Pokemon we don't see too often.
No,
And,
not at all.
really doing well in that game two, and not quite enough in that game three, unfortunately. Of course, we do have two more excellent games coming up for you. We're going to be kicking off with India versus Portugal here. So we can now just have a look at how these two teams are currently doing here.
I'm really excited to be catching this match. I mean, perfect time to be hopping on the mic with you, right? So, I mean, I'll let you go a little more into these players and how this match should fare out.
Yeah, so you can see here we've got three matches already with India versus Portugal. Of course, Portugal are already knocked out of this tournament, but India still have to be getting some wins here if they want to advance. They need 6 wins to guarantee that they will be moving on to the next stages here. They started off pretty well. They've got 2 so far, so they need 4 more wins to be able to advance into that top 16.
Right? Of course, that 2-1 lead. I mean, there's a little room here, but of course you want to be securing those wins. And the matchup we're going to be looking at is Rajan Ball versus Diogo Henriques.
Yeah, so definitely going to be an interesting match coming out from both of these players. I just want to give a quick shout out to that Pheromosa before we move on. Pokemon we don't see too often, but really cool Pokemon coming out there. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting match between these two players. We need 4 more wins for India, and Portugal are of course just playing for the pride. So has the potential of bringing out some bit more quirky picks because they don't need to focus on winning too much. They just want to have some fun now. But India do need to focus very hard on how they're going to be winning. And we can have a look at the teams now of the players just to see how they are going to be trying to do that.
All right. And first off, I mean, nothing too spicy here. We're going to see from Rajan here is going to be Zacian. I mean, one of the top restricteds I feel right now, but it's going to be that double genie paired off with a couple of the most popular Pokemon that we've seen here in Series 10, which is going to be Incineroar, Urshifu, and this Rillaboom.
Yeah, Double Genie is usually applied in previous formats for Landorus and Thundurus instead. So we're going to be seeing one of the wrong genies here for the Double Genie, but nothing stopping them from being the Double Genies, especially because they are both going to be in their incarnate form. So Landorus are going to be having access to those very strong Earth powers with that sheer force, opting for the damage instead of the Intimidates that could come out, and going for the Tailwind option for the Tornadus as well. So something we don't see too often on the Zacian teams. You see Tornadus a lot more commonly paired with that Kyogre, so you have the Hurricane getting that 100% accuracy, but nothing stopping you from putting your Tornadus onto another team so that you can still get access to that Prankster Tailwind.
I mean, just getting that speed control at any match is just so invaluable, especially if your opponent wants to be going for it as well. But heading over to Algo Enriquez to see what he is going to be bringing for this match. And I mean, here is something a little more spicy, but something we don't really get to see too often. It is going to be a Duskmane Necrozma here, paired out with some other fun picks. I'm eyeing up that Galarian Zapdos in particular.
Yeah, Galarian Zapdos is going to pair very well with the Necrozma. You want to be intimidating that to put a stop to those physical attacks that are going to be coming out, but then you do have that Defiant on the Zapdos with that fighting typing as well that can be able to one-shot the Incineroars very easily, as you can't put a stop to its damage output. You'll just be increasing it instead if you do try to intimidate. So it looks like it's a much more Trick Room-orientated team here coming out from Diogo. They've got the potential of the Trick Room on the Necrozma and the Mimikyu as well. So the Tornadus going to be a bit awkward setting up those Tailwinds if you are going to be facing down that Trick Room team.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to be controlling the speed is just taking it away altogether and flipping the dimensions on their head, being able to go for that Trick Room. And the double options to really secure a way to be setting it up, especially with the potential of Amoonguss to Rage Powder away. Anything that could stop a Trick Room from going up.
Yeah, so it's definitely going to be interesting to see what's going to be coming out from both of these players. Of course, the Portugal just playing for that pride, going for some quite slightly more quirky picks with that Necrozma and the Zapdos. But India do need to secure those wins so to make sure that they are advancing. So we can jump into the game now to have a look at how the players are going to be trying to do that.
Right. So excited to see what is going to be coming out on to these leads here and what these players are going to be going for. And I mean, I love the fact that we get the quirky picks here coming out with like the Dustmane across. But I feel like it's a fun chance to really be able to like test it out too. Being able to bring it in this format. No, there's nothing really too much on the line, but being able to test it out in this meta.
Also pairs very strongly up into Zacian. One-on-one, Necrozma will come out on top because it does resist the two stab type attacks that come out from the Zacian, whereas the steel typing is neutral against Zacian, so you will be able to come out on top with the Sunsteel Strikes. You can get yourself faster as well if you click that Trick Room button. It does also have options like Dragon Dance that you don't really see too often on Necrozma at all. It does very much more often opt for the Trick Room instead to help out the rest of the team with the speed control as well. And given how slow the team is coming out for Diogo here, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see Trick Room as an option on that Necrozma. Even if there's not a Trick Room on the Necrozma, it's almost certainly going to be on the Mimikyu at least. So going to be trying to want to reverse those speeds here because most of the Pokemon on Diogo's side of the field are naturally slower than the Pokemon coming out from Rajan's side of the field. So it's going to be up to Rajan to try and put a stop to that Trick Room, whether that's just going to be going with those fake outs that can come out from the Incineroar and the Rillaboom. Maybe a taunt coming out from the Tornadus as well. But then if you're trying to cycle those fake outs, which is usually a good way of stopping the Trick Room, if you're cycling in the Incineroar and the Rillaboom, that is also going to be cycling the Intimidate. That will be very good against the Necrozma Dustmane. But then if you've got the Zapdos on the field when that Intimidate goes off, it's going to be boosting it up and it'll be able to do a huge amount of damage.
Yeah, and there's quite a few things here that wouldn't really appreciate going against a Zapdos, let alone a Galarian Zapdos that has multiple attack boosts from Defiant. So definitely have to be playing that a little carefully here to make sure you're not setting up a big disastrous bird. But it's time to be heading into this match finally, because I'm really excited to see this Dustmane Necrozma in action. I don't really get to see it too often, I'm not gonna lie. I'm pretty psyched to be catching this match. And first coming out right out of the gates, it's going to be a Necrozma paired up with the Incineroar, going against the Incineroar paired up with the Zacian. So both restricteds coming out to play right away.
And paired up with the Incineroars, so being able to lead with the Incineroar, not in the face of the Galarian Zapdos here, works out very well for Rajan, because we are going to be seeing it from Rajan's side of the field. So yeah, the Intimidate's just going to be fired off, going to be very useful into both of these steel restricteds here. Going to be putting the Zacian back to neutral, but the Necrozma down to -1, so not going to be doing as much damage as they could do. And Necrozma, it does sacrifice coverage usually against the Incineroar. If it wants to be able to hit it with ground-type attacks, that ends up being Earth Power, which is on the special side, and that's really not the side that you want to be attacking with Necrozma. You've got Brick Break as well that can be doing some reasonable damage to the Incineroar, but usually you want the other Pokemon that are partnered with the Necrozma to be able to deal with the Incineroar. Currently, you don't have that. You've only got your own Incineroar. You've managed to get an Intimidate down onto it, to put a stop to the Incineroar from being able to do some reasonable damage to the Necrozma this turn, especially with that Prism Armor, keeping it a bit more safe from the super effective hits. And you've got the Intimidate down on the Zacian as well, so that's not going to be doing as much damage going into this first turn.
First on, and here's the time for the fake out. I'm going to go first, and Zacian, I mean, it was at neutral, but now is going to be at a +2, going for that sword stance. Of course, Incineroar on Ozan, not going to be able to do much, but the Dustmane Necrozma looking to set up in other ways, going to be twisting the dimensions and getting a Trick Room off.
Sword stance coming out from Zacian is very nice. Going to be able to get rid of that Intimidate, put the Zacian back into +2, so it's actually going to be able to do some very good damage coming out here. But Trick Room is going to allow that Necrozma and the Incineroar to move first before that Zacian. They both did get intimidated, so maybe a Flare Blitz and a Sunsteel Strike would not be enough to KO this Zacian. We'll have to see if that is the option that's going to be picked here for Diogo. And if it's not able to pick up the knockout, then it will be able to do some really nice damage thanks to that Sword Stance, but not going to be doing any damage this turn.
And not wanting to risk anything, going to go for that Protect and Throat Chop coming out from Diogo to make sure no parting shots can go off as he's looking to set up his own Dustmane Necrozma here, feeling his own Sword Stance. And there it is, that Throat Chop, preventing the parting shot. No pivot out, except for anything manual, of course, and no additional attack drop onto that Dustmane Necrozma.
It's really nice to see throat chops in a second interaction, or I should say the main interaction coming into play. You usually just see it for damage, because not too many moves are sound-based, but passing shot is one of them. So you saw the interactions there of the speeds on the Incineroar. The Incineroar on Rajan's side of the field should be faster at this point, was able to get the fake out into the opposing Incineroar first. That's what happens when you have the faster Incineroar, but when you've got the slower Incineroar, in this case in the Trick Room, you'll be able to get the Throat Chop into the opposing Incineroar to stop those parting shots. So now the Incineroar is stuck on the field, would need to switch out manually instead of that passing shot to try and start recycling those Intimidates.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't want this Dustman or Crossman to be going for those sword stances and setting out, so a pivot is what we are going to be seeing here. Rillaboom going to be hitting the field, and of course bringing the grass along with it. And I mean, this point, Poison Incineroar going to be hitting a Flare Blitz. I mean, it's intimidating out, but that's still a really healthy amount of damage done over on Rajan's Zacian here. And that Sunsteel Strike that you were talking about earlier is going to be coming out. It's going to be a lot more devastating now that it's gotten that attack boost. It's all going to come down to how much it's going to do, and Zacian has no chance and is going to be taken out.
Yeah, the Swords Dance there, meaning that it's definitely strong enough to take out that Zacian. It would have been interesting to see if it would have been able to survive without that Swords Dance with just a -1 on the Necrozma, but that +1 instead are going to be able to pick up that knockout. And now the Restricted is taken care of on Rajan's side of the field without doing any damage. It was able to set up the Swords Dance, but then was just KO'd, and now that's a really, really strong move from Diogo, being able to take out the Restricted for no real damage on their side of the field. Incineroar's just taking a tiny bit of chip from that fake out, but that's just about it. The Urshifu Rapid Strike is going to be joining the field, so that is going to be able to threaten down that Incineroar very well. But it's not so much into the Necrozma because it is a very bulky Pokemon. And so it will do some nice damage with the Surging Strikes, but then if you leave it alone, that allows the Incineroar just to go for maybe a passing shot to switch out so it can get in another Pokemon that wants to be in the Trick Room, or just get some damage down with the Flare Blitz going down into that Rillaboom. If you do switch out the Incineroar into the Zapdos, maybe, because the Incineroar is now definitely waiting in the back, when that would join the field, that would be able to activate that Defiance. No parting shot coming out from the Incineroar, it is just going to be switching straight out instead.
Yeah, and no Zapdos, but instead going to be going for that Amoonguss, a Pokemon that does certainly appreciate Trick Room here. I mean, Fake Out coming out, Necrozma is not going to do too much this turn, and Urshifu just taking the opportunity to set up with that Substitute to help prevent his longevity on the field.
Yeah, Substitute coming out from the Urshifu is not a move we see too often,
Not at all.
But a very, very strong choice here. Substitute on Urshifu, when it's normally run, you want to prevent the Grassy Glides coming out from the Rillaboom from being able to pick up the knockout, but in this case, it's going to keep it safe from the Spores from the Amoonguss that did switch in. So, yeah, really, really nice move choice on the Urshifu, because now the Amoonguss, it could break the Substitute if it's carrying something like a Grass Knot, or maybe even a Sludge Bomb at this point would be strong enough to pick up the knockout on that Substitute. Pollen Puff, if it's the only move of choice on the Amoonguss, probably not going to be enough on that Urshifu. And then it would be down to the Necrozma to pick up the extra bit of damage. But if the Amoonguss is able to pick up the knockout on that Substitute, the last move on that Necrozma, we haven't seen it yet, but it definitely could be that Photon Geyser. And with that increased stage of attack that is now disappearing thanks to the Intimidate, still probably enough because you have chipped yourself with that Substitute.
Yeah, being at neutral is still going to be devastating. Amoonguss, though, just opting to go for the Rage Powder to keep this Decimator Necrozma nice and safe. And Photon Geyser, there's the reveal, the last move on here. I mean, all it's going to be doing breaking Substitute, but I mean, getting that Substitute broken is obviously going to be worthwhile down the road.
And Surging Strikes has to hit into that Amoonguss as well.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, Amoonguss is good. Amoonguss takes this well. Amoonguss is not phased in the face of a Surging Strikes here. I mean, that's 3 critical hits back to back, and look how little damage that did.
Yeah, it's gonna be pretty much negligible at this point. If you've got the Amoonguss on the field and you're able to click the Rage Powder, that's gonna make the Urshifu somewhat useless. The Substitute is nice to be able to keep it safe from the Spores, but not from the Rage Powders at all. So at least the Trick Room has been stalled out now from Rajan's side of the field, but Necrozma has taken no damage at all. It can pretty much set up the Trick Room again whenever it wants. Sure, it can get faked out this turn to stall out one of those turns from setting up the Trick Room, and you can get a Substitute up once again on the Urshifu, but then you do open up your Incineroar to be potentially spored by that Amoonguss, and only really a safety goggles would keep you safe from that.
Yeah, and then what's stopping Diogo from going next turn, right, Trick Room? So Fake Out, of course, going to stop it this turn. Urshifu looking to just set up once again. As soon as the substitute is broken, going to set it back up. And Safety Goggles on the Incineroar means that Spore that the Amoonguss went for going to be useless in this case, but a nice little piece of information to have going forward in this best of 3.
Yeah, it definitely is. But Spore is extra useless now thanks to that substitute once again. But really, Amoonguss, all it needs to do is go for that Rage Powder. Sure, it'll take a Flare Blitz potentially from this Incineroar that will do a lot of damage, but it keeps the Necrozma safe from the Urshifu at least. And we saw how much damage the Surging Strikes was doing that to the Amoonguss. It's really not much at all. And the Flare Blitz would do a reasonable amount of damage to the Necrozma. Because of the safety goals as well, can't be Rage Powdered, so would be able to hit into that Necrozma. Maybe you have to worry about a potential weakness policy coming out from the Necrozma as well, that could be boosting it back up, cancelling out the Swords Dance that was really reduced by those Intimidates, but in fact, no Rage Powder coming out, Surging Strikes hitting into that Necrozma.
Yeah, of course, when the Rage Powder wouldn't have affected the Incineroar, but letting that Necrozma take those Surging Strike hits is quite interesting here. Incineroar, of course, going to be following up with this Flare Blitz. Not enough to be dealing a KO, but definitely bringing it down real close combined with the amount of damage Surging Strikes did. But Berries coming out here to at least heal some of the HP back, and Pollen Puff is going to be revealed and going to be healing that up even more, so it's almost like the turn didn't really happen except for that Trick Room, of course, so being able to set up and not really get punished for it.
Yeah, that's a really, really strong Pollen Puff coming out from the Amoonguss. You could have gone for the Rage Powder just to keep the Surging Strikes away from the Necrozma, but yeah, the Pollen Puff with the Citrus Berry as well puts the Necrozma, especially with the Grassy Terrain recovery as well, just before, puts it back to pretty much near full HP. So really, you just get through that turn with a tiny bit of chip on Necrozma and Trick Room set up once again. You can't go for a Spore into the Incineroar or the Urshifu at least. You do need to try and break that substitute before you can go for those Spores. But we still haven't seen any other offensive move on this Amoonguss yet. Pollen Puff will not be able to do it. It does need to be at least the Photon Geyser coming out from the Necrozma to be able to break the substitute on that Urshifu if the Amoonguss is only carrying Pollen Puff as the offensive move. But there's really no offensive pressure onto the Incineroar at this point. You can't go for the Spore into the Incineroar. Pollen Puff's not going to be doing much damage at all. You may need to start going for another Swords Dance with the Necrozma as well, especially if you can get that down that Intimidate onto the opposing Incineroar with your own one to get that damage potential reduced onto the Necrozma.
Of course, Amoonguss going and hiding in the back here, and Photon Geyser is going to come out from the Dusty Necrozma, going ahead once again to break that substitute. And at this point too, I mean, going for it, it's not getting that Grassy Terrain recovery to keep letting it go for more substitutes. Flare Blitz, though, targeted into the Incineroar, of course, not really going to do too much. That's more so for the Amoonguss. But the Surging Strikes that is coming out is going to do a lot more on that poor Incineroar swap in here. And I mean, Incineroar not looking too good. That's bringing it right down to one last hit. But Pinchberry coming out, looking to try and bring this in range where it can live one more Surging Strikes, and I think it might, and there it is.
Yeah, very well trained Incineroar, able to just survive with that Pinchberry as well. The Citrus Berry wouldn't have done it. We saw that on the Necrozma instead. So very good item choice on the Incineroar, coming in clutch, allowing it to survive, and now has the opportunity to go for a Fake Out or even switch out, preserve the Intimidate that could come off from the Incineroar as well. So very, very nicely trained Incineroar to be able to survive that. Could go for a Fake Out into the opposing Incineroar and a Photon Geyser into the Urshifu. There wouldn't be too much stopping that. You could be protecting your Urshifu at least to be able to put a stop to that. Switch out into the Rillaboom would still take a reasonable amount of damage from the Photon Geyser as well.
And of course, we got a little sneak peek in the menu, but that Rillaboom is going to be coming out, at least saving the Urshifu until later, or maybe once the room is done here. Maybe seeing that as more key to be winning this match here. Fake Out coming out, though, is going to be targeting down into Incineroar, and there is that ever so pesky Photon Geyser hitting into the Rillaboom, and that is going to be a whole lot of damage dealt in on that swap.
Enough for a 2-hit knockout, so really good damage down onto the Rillaboom. It does have the access to Fake Out now, You did get faked out on Rajan's side of the field. The Incineroar was not able to move, but now you've got the fake out pressure on Rajan's side of the field. So that could go for the fake outs, even to pick up the knockout on the Incineroar at this point. Probably going to be in range of that. Or you could get the fake out down into the Necrozma so that your Rillaboom is able to survive from anything that the Photon guys that could come out from the Necrozma. Maybe not the Flare Blitz that could come out from the Incineroar. So still a little bit of a tricky situation, especially because Rillaboom don't often carry Protect, especially because we can see with the sneak preview as well, that is the Assault Vest. So wouldn't need to go on the offensive here, either to pick up the knockout on the Incineroar or go for the fake out just to stop the attacks coming out from the Necrozma. But either way, the Rillaboom is open to an attack from either Pokemon.
Of course, and Incineroar going to go back and hide in the back. Grassy Glide coming out. I mean, very effective, but it didn't need to be very effective. This Incineroar down to just a sliver of health. It's going to take that down easily. Another Photon Geyser, like we've seen this one before, hitting into the Rillaboom, going to be taking it out and leave Rajan to just 2 Pokemon left here.
And now the Incineroar is going to be switching in. There is a free slot on Diogo's side of the field. It could be the Amoonguss switching in, but it could be that other Pokemon waiting in the back. If it is the Zapdos, this is the prime opportunity to bring it in because Intimidate is going to be hitting the field. Zapdos is the choice of Pokemon in the back for Diogo, as the Incineroar is forced onto the field to Intimidate it and give it that Defiant boost. So there hadn't really been much damage potential onto this Incineroar for the entire game, but now there is a very, very big threat to it on that opposing side of the field with that Defiant boosted Zapdos. Now you get to click whatever fighting move you've got on that Zapdos, whether that's the Close Combat or the Thunderous Kick into that Incineroar. That's enough to pick up a knockout at this point. And because the Necrozma has been intimidated as well, depending on the training, the Photon Geyser might turn into a special type attack. If that Intimidate has put the attack lower than the special attack at this point, because it should be sitting at -1 attack at this point, thanks to that earlier Swords Dance with those Intimidates as well. That would hit the Urshifu on its weaker special defensive side, so it should be potentially doing even more damage to that Urshifu, depending on whether that's a physical or special type attack.
Of course, Zapdos not going to be able to give him the opportunity to do much this turn. Fake out hitting into that slot, and here comes the Photon Geyser. It's going to be hitting like a truck and taking that Urshifu out of the match and leaving this poor Incineroar all by itself. I mean, top use Pokemon, but I don't think it's going to make anything happen here.
It was doing pretty well against the other 3, but yeah, Zapdos is not the one it wants to face down at all. Even though we've got still a little bit more of the Trick Room, and Incineroar should be outspeeding that Zapdos, probably need a Flare Blitz critical hit, and even then may not even be enough onto the Zapdos at that point. Whereas the Zapdos just need to respond with any fighting attack. Maybe even one of the weaker ones, if it had like Low Sweep or something like that, should be enough onto the Incineroar at this point. So I didn't have to deal with the Incineroar at all, just had to have that check waiting in the back. Ready to take care of it as you slowly pick apart the rest of the team. The Zacian dropped very early in that game for Rajan, and then the Necrozma just really wasn't threatened at all. The one turn it took big damage, it just got healed off immediately by the Citrus Berry and the Pollen Puff as well. So it definitely needs to find a better way of breaking through that Necrozma, because it was just allowed to sit on the field. It got that Swords Dance up. It was still doing some very good damage, and even when it got intimidated finally down to -1, that turned the Photon Geyser into that special type attack. It probably wasn't enough on the Urshifu if it was a -1 physical attack, but able to just still pick up the knockout thanks to that interesting interaction of the Photon Geyser turning it into the special type attack. So you do definitely need to find a better way through this Necrozma if you're on Rajan's side of the field.
Oh, for sure. I mean, at the end of the match there, that Necrozma was sitting at almost its full health, being able to, with that berry, with the Pollen Puff, with the Grassy Terrain recovery. I mean, it was sitting at full, and just the fact that it was sat there, didn't swap out or anything, and allowed to just dominate the match like that is something that can't happen in this game too if Rajan wants to look to try and settle this score here. And I mean, that Zapdos right at the end there, we went through that entire game not even knowing what that 4th Pokemon was. We could take our best guess, but it wasn't until the very end that it was revealed to really just put the nail in the coffin for that Incineroar and really just show, yeah, I have this match. It's about to be time for a game 2.
Yeah, so even if you find the way through the Necrozma, you still have to contend with that Zapdos. So we'll have to see how Rajan is going to be adjusting going into this game too. The Landorus is definitely a Pokemon that could threaten big damage onto that Necrozma. Even though the Prism Armor is going to be activated on that, active on that Necrozma and weakening the Earth Power somewhat, you still got to hit it with some good damage, and Landorus is definitely going to be able to provide that. The Swords Dance on the Zacian as well allows it to be able to still hit that Necrozma for some good damage, but it was able to only just get that Swords Dance up and then protect and then get KO'd. So it didn't actually do any damage to Diogo's side of the field. If you can manage to get your Zacian into a position where it gets that Swords Dance once again, but it's able to actually get off an attack, it's going to be able to make use of that a lot better. So do need to keep the Zacian a lot safer going into this second game, because it just got KO'd way too early in that first game. If you get those cycling of the fake outs down with the Rillaboom and the Incineroar, you can keep the Zacian a bit more safe if you keep fake out active, so that it's not going to be taking as much damage from both Pokemon. If you can keep it limited to one Pokemon attacking the Zacian, it should be able to make it through the Trick Room turns. But then if you start cycling those Incineroar and Rillaboom switch-ins once again, at one point you could be switching in that Incineroar on the potential of a Zapdos switch-in.
Yeah, definitely have to be so careful with that. And I mean, right out of the gate for Diogo, we're going to see the same lead, that Incineroar and the Dust Crossbow that worked so well in Game 1, but adjustment coming out. Zacian's not going to be putting itself in harm's way right off of the bat. Instead, it's going to be the Urshifu coming out for Rajan, paired up with the Incineroar.
Yeah, this makes a lot more sense for Rajan, because that Urshifu is going to be able to exert a lot of offensive pressure onto both these Pokemon immediately. The Zacian would have been intimidated and would have to set up its Swords Dance to try and start doing some good damage again. Urshifu is a Pokemon that doesn't really care about Intimidate, even though it is that physical type, because if you just go for those Surging Strikes, you're going to get those critical hits. So Intimidate not really going to matter. And we've already seen, at this point, we've seen the Intimidate go first on the Incineroar on Rajan's side of the field. It's almost certainly going to be the faster Incineroar at this point. You get to choose which one you fake out, whether that's going to be a trading of fake outs, where you just fake out the Necrozma and the Urshifu and just have a turn 0 and move on to the next one. Or, because you are the faster Incineroar, you can get the fake out into the opposing Incineroar, which we did see in Game 1, and that would just free up the Urshifu to get a Surging Strikes into whatever it would want to go for, or if it wants to set up that substitute once again.
Yeah, Incineroar, though, not wanting to be faked out, is going to be swapping into that Amoonguss instead. So Amoonguss going to be taking this fake out for just a little bit of chip damage that it is. At least the Urshifu going to be able to set up the substitute. I mean, makes it so Diogo actually has to respond to that, but this Necrozma, free of any threat so far, is just going to be able to set up that Trick Room.
Now Mungus next to it can just start fighting off those Pollen Puffs once again. Spore not going to be effective this turn. We're in a very, very similar situation as we were in that Game 1, where you've got the safety goggles on the Incineroar, and the substitute is active on the Urshifu, so you need the Photon Geyser to be able to break that. So Mungus here, I'm going to be able to provide too much other than maybe the Pollen Puff into the Necrozma, but then because it's going to be moving first, that wouldn't be very effective because no damage would have been on the Necrozma at that point. Really, it's either got to switch out here or just Rage Powder instead to try and keep the Necrozma away from the Surging Strikes, but it's going to be switching out into the Incineroar instead.
Incineroar just looking to try and intimidate and, fake out pressure next turn on the field. Of course, always going to be a positive here. Shifu not wanting to risk that substitute being broken, just going to sit safe behind that substitute and even safer behind a Protect. Photon Geyser not going to do anything, targeting into that slot, and that means a Parting Shot can come out freely onto this Dust Necrozma and lower that attack even more here.
It's going to be keeping the Intimidate waiting in the back once again, going to be reducing it even more, but at this point is not going to matter because, I guess because now it's -1 on the special attack and -2 on the attack, it's going to be even more interesting interactions of which is actually going to be the higher attack stat, because of course Photon Geyser is going to be physical if your attack is higher, or special attack if your special attack is currently higher. So with the Parting Shot dropping both of the stats is going to turn it a bit more awkward. It was going to almost certainly confirm that it was a special attack when it was at -1 attack and neutral as special attack, but awkward things are going to happen when it's -1 and -2. We'll have to see how that's going to come into play here, because if it is still a physical attack at this point, it's not going to be able to do too much damage to the Urshifu. It shouldn't be able to knock it out after it's broken the substitute, but still be strong enough to break the substitute. And we saw that it was able to do just over half to the Rillaboom in that Game 1. Probably not going to be doing as much damage, especially because now it's an Incineroar.
Yeah, well, that -2 attack is going to be a -3 as Incineroar hits the field in place of that Rillaboom, going to be intimidating it down further, and on Diogo's end, Incineroar swapping out for the Amoonguss yet again. Photon Geyser being able to hit into the Urshifu this time around, and going to just break this substitute, so just as to try and deal with this Urshifu sooner rather than later, as Rajan going to take the opportunity to fire back a Surging Strikes, but, I mean, this Amoonguss out on the field instead of the Incineroar, I mean, we saw before in Game 1 how little it did, and, I mean, we could all see how this one was going to go.
Yeah, able to take that very comfortably, and now feeling a bit more confident that that should be a special attack once again, because it is -3 against the -1, and now the substitute has been broken on the Urshifu. The Incineroar has switched in and has Fake Out Pressure ready to go, but now the substitute has been broken on the Urshifu. That means it is open to be Sport at this point, so you can get a Fake Out to stop the Photon Geyser, or you can get a Fake Out to stop the Spore, but one of them can now land into this Urshifu unless it goes for the Protect or a Switch Out at this point. You do have the Rillaboom that could very easily switch in on that Spore, but then you could be opening yourself up to the Photon Geyser, but not this turn, and the Necrozma has finally decided that this is the turn to switch out.
This is the first time that Necrozma has seen the inside of the Pokeball, staying on the field the entire first game, and so far in the second game, but finally, too many attack drops, going to just go and reset that all. And Rillaboom going to be swapping in for the Urshifu as well. I mean, that Spore target into that slot is going to be doing absolutely nothing. And Incineroar is going to get the opportunity to fire off a Flare Blitz. It's not as strong as it could have been since there was that Incineroar swap in, but still dealing some chip damage into that Amoonguss.
Yeah, you need to start getting the damage down onto this Amoonguss. It is able to recover quite nicely. I believe I saw the Black Sludge come out from the Amoonguss, so able to recover with that grassy terrain as well. Going to be able to get some really nice healing action going. If it switches out, the Regenerator might even put it back to full HP from the range of HP it is at this point. And now the Incineroar switched in, it's going to be offering some potential damage into the Rillaboom with the Flare Blitz. You could go for a Fake Out into the opposing Incineroar, just to put a stop to that from being able to Flare Blitz the Amoonguss, but the Amoonguss isn't really doing too much on the field at this point. It probably does want to switch out to get that Regenerator going, because you can't Spore either of the Pokemon, you can't Rage Powder either of the Pokemon. You could get some damage, I guess, with the Pollen Puff into the Rillaboom, because it would be a super effective hit. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Amoonguss just switch out here. The Incineroar does have the potential to go on the offensive and get some good damage down into the opposing Rillaboom.
Right, and sure enough, that Amoonguss is leaving the field. Can be such an impactful Pokemon, but just not doing anything in this case. As that Duskmane Necrozma goes and hits the field once again. Fake Out is going to come out on both ends here. I mean, Zero on the other end still did get to Fake Out first, but gets a little chip damage from the Rillaboom in return.
Yes, always awkward when you go for the Fake Out into the opposing Fake Outs. And yeah, the speed interactions there have been reversed, so the Incineroar was able to get the Fake Out before the Rillaboom was able to land it into the Incineroar. So a very, very free switch in for this Necrozma, which is exactly what Diogo wants to see. No damage potential coming out from the Incineroar because it was faked out. The Rillaboom did have the option to go for a U-turn at that point, try to switch out into the Urshifu, and almost certainly the Zacian waiting in the back as well, but effectively a wasted turn at this point. So you get a tiny bit of chip with the fake out that was just recovered off by the grassy terrain, and now it's finally time to pivot out with that U-turn.
Yeah, the U-turn pivot out, being able to bring something else new in, and I mean, just start chipping away a little bit into that Duskmane Necrozma, because we saw how little damage was done in that first game, and that needs to change. This Pokemon cannot be left unchecked, and the Rillaboom's going to be swapping out into that Zacian. Intrepid Sword going to get the boost, especially now that the Incineroar is already out on the other side. Rajan looking to pivot out even more, going for the parting shot into the Duskmane Necrozma, and getting the opportunity to bring something else back out onto the field, which is going to be that Urshifu. A lot of offensive pressure on the field right now to be facing down against this Necrozma and this Incineroar. Incineroar, though, just going to go for the Flare Blitz into the freshly swapped in Zacian, and Zacian does not appreciate that. Too much damage, also going to get burned.
Yeah, that's not what you want to see with the Zacian at all. The Trick Room is going to go up once again as well, so yeah, Zacian is not having a good time here, and not able to do any damage in that first game, literally, and now figuratively can't do any damage in this one because thanks to that burn. So yeah, that's a heartbreaking burn coming out from the Flare. It's not very likely to happen. Getting some good damage down onto the Zacian as well. And now you can get a knockout with the Incineroar if you want onto the opposing Zacian with the Flare Blitz, thanks to that Trick Room being set up. You've got the Photon Geyser ready to go into that Urshifu. Could also switch out into that Incineroar, of course. You could try and get the pivoting action going with the Incineroar. Try and get the parting shot as the Incineroar comes in, because the Zacian isn't really doing too much damage anymore. You can get those Swords Dances, maybe, to try and cancel out the burn at least, but that's taking a turn of not doing anything, and then you'll just effectively have cancelled out the burn, but you're still not doing too much damage to the Incineroar or the Necrozma. So Zacian is almost dead weight at this point, thanks to that burn. So you're going to have to rely on the rest of the team to be able to break through Diogo's team. We saw there wasn't really too many good ways of breaking through that Necrozma on Rajan's side of the field, and Zacian Swords Dancing was one of them, but now that has been severely limited.
Yeah, I mean, Swords Dancing in Trick Room with this little HP is definitely something that's a little difficult to pull off. Rajan going to pivot out into the Incineroar, just looking to, I mean, if my restricted can't hit for that much, neither is yours. Going to pivot out and try and lower the attack onto Diogo's Duskmane as well. Urshifu just opting to stay safe this time around with that Protect. Photon Geyser coming out right into the Urshifu. It's not going to do anything.
And now we're in a very similar position that we've seen in that game 1 and the game 2. We've got the Amoonguss. It can maybe heal with the Pollen Puff. There's a tiny bit of damage, I think, onto the Necrozma, so you could try and just heal that a little bit off, because the Spore or the Pollen Puff's not going to be doing too much. You've got the potential of the switch out into the Incineroar, but then you've got to contend with that Surging Strikes that could come out as well, especially because the Photon Geyser is not being fired off into that Urshifu, because the Necrozma is switching into the Incineroar.
Incineroar need to come back into the field instead. There's been so much pivoting. I mean, Rajan did so much pivoting in the first game, but Diogo has not been pivoting as much in the first game, but definitely switching up in the second game, not wanting that Duskmane Necrozma to be slowed down by anything. Urshifu is swapping out for that Zacian at this point. I kind of feel bad for it getting burned on the swap in, but at least that means it's not going to get spored. Already having a status condition, and this Amoonguss is then left susceptible to a Flare Blitz hit from Rajan's Incineroar.
Yeah, I guess there's at least one positive coming out from the burns, so it will be able to move. It won't be able to do much damage, but at least it can do some damage. So yeah, the Amoonguss able to survive the Incineroar's Flare Blitz pretty comfortably with that Intimidate as well. Could just regenerate it once again. Could try and get some recovery going into the Incineroar with the Pollen Puff. But yeah, it's still not too much damage coming out from Rajan's side of the field, especially with that burn Zacian. You can try and get another Flare Blitz into the Amoonguss, and that would at least catch as a Necrozma that could switch in, or maybe even the Zapdos would still do a reasonable amount of damage, but the Amoonguss does want to switch out here, get that Regenerator going once again.
Necrozma, nice and fresh with no attack drops, going to hit the field. Zacian, though, taking the opportunity to swap out, and those restrictions don't want to be on the same field at the same time, it feels like at this point. Each of them swapping in and out as the other leaves. Rillaboom going to be hitting the field instead. And I mean, going to come down to these Incineroars. Already out on the field, so nothing happening there as Diogo gets to go for the Throat Chop and limiting Rajan from being able to go for any sort of parting shot action.
Yeah, I think that was probably like an actual person fake out there, trying to confuse the opponents by going for another fake out.
It worked on me.
Indeed. So yeah, the Necrozma able to just completely freely switch in. There was a potential of going for the Flare Blitz into that Amoonguss, get that damage down into the Necrozma, but nothing coming out there. It has been Throat Chopped now. It does last for 2 turns, so it's still going to be in effect this turn. You can't go for the parting shot with the Incineroar. You would need to just get that hard switch out once again. But you got the fake out that can be active on the Rillaboom. You can put a stop to the opposing Incineroar going for the parting shots, or the Necrozma going for the, I guess, the Sunsteel switch at this point, because everything's switching out. So yeah, it's still going to be able to do some very good damage with the Necrozma, whether that's going to be the Sunsteel Strike or the Photon Guys into the Rillaboom, because we saw it did over half in that previous game.
Oh, for sure. And the fake out, at least coming out here at Rillaboom, having a much more successful time with it, being able to slow down that Necrozma. Flare Blitz coming out, Diogo, right again into that Rillaboom, and so much damage being done. Not enough to quite be picking up that KO, but bringing it down real close.
Yes, very well trained Rillaboom coming out there, being able to take the Flare Blitz means that it is able to stick around, could switch out once again, get that fake out pressure back on the field once again. And now the Urshifu's hit the field, and just in time as the Trick Room has run out. Would have been open to the Photon Geyser from the Necrozma, but now that the Trick Room is over, you do have the potential of going for the offensive with the Surging Strikes, or going for the Substitute once again, and try and play a little bit more passively to try and stall out a Trick Room that really can't be set up, stopped from being set up once again.
Yeah, these Trick Rooms are really hurting. I mean, we're really being able to control that speed. And these Surging Strikes not hurting nearly as much here. Necrozma taking them so well, not even being brought down to half of its HP. Rillaboom looking for that pivot, going to be dealing a bit more damage, but I mean, that's just putting it in range of getting that Citrus Berry. And this Necrozma is looking almost as good as it was before, but at least the pivot then gets to come out. But I mean, despite what Rajan's throwing at this Necrozma, it's just not going down.
And there's still the Incineroar left to move on Diogo's side of the field. If that is going to be switching out with the Parting Shot into the Amoonguss, you can recover all of that back with a Pollen Puff. So we'll have to see if that's going to be coming out from the Incineroar here. Yep, there's the Parting Shot. And wouldn't be surprised if we see that Amoonguss just to be healing that Necrozma again.
I mean, that seems to be the favorite, the Incineroar into the Amoonguss and vice versa. And I mean, it's been faring super well, and now that there is Urshifu out on the field, no Rillaboom to stop any Spore shenanigans, but instead it's actually going to be the Zapdos. I mean, Zapdos is seeing potential closer end of this battle and wanting to get onto the field here, as Diogo is going to be able to yet again set up a Trick Room.
Yeah, makes sense. You probably want to start going on the offensive here because this second game has been going on for quite a while. I wouldn't be surprised if we're getting somewhat close to time at this point. So you do want to start picking up knockouts. Both players have all 4 of their Pokemon at this point, because there hasn't been too much damage dealt. You've been able to pivot around with all of your Pokemon multiple times. I do wonder what the world record for the amount of switches in a game is at this point. This must be a pretty good contender for that accolade. But yeah, bringing in the Zapdos here, it's going to be able to put on a lot more pressure. It still has to contend with a Fake Out coming out from the Incineroar, but does threaten the Incineroar and the Urshifu very heavily with the fighting type attacks or the flying type attacks into their respective slots. So probably need to be going for that Fake Out into the Zapdos, but then you open up your Urshifu to be still open to that Photon Geyser that can come out from the Necrozma. So really nice position, getting 2 offensive threats on the field just as Trick Room was set up.
Yeah, you were just talking about not too much damage being dealt, but from all the pivoting for Rajan's Pokemon, not necessarily looking the healthiest. Of course, the Urshifu looking a bit better, going to stay healthy with the Protect, but the Zacian already so close to being KO'd, and Burn is going to be taking that close combat on the swap in. And what was once a almost even game, 4-4, is now going to be Diogo taking the Pokemon advantage, even though the Urshifu does get to stay around for their turn. Photon Geyser not being able to do anything to it.
And the issue with the switching out the Zacian, you get to sacrifice Zacian, which I don't think it did any damage in either game in this case. So yeah, you do sacrifice that Zacian, but that means you're bringing in the Incineroar once again, and Zapdos is on the field. So you've got that Defiant boost once again in this second game as well. At least you get to intimidate the Necrozma, but that's still kind of a negative when you're facing down the Urshifu as well. If you get the Intimidate down with Necrozma, suddenly you've got the special Photon Geyser, which is still able to do a huge amount of damage. So it's still incredibly awkward for Rajan. You can still have that Fake Out now. Stalled out of turn of Fake Out, and there, of course, is that 3 minutes left. So we are getting a lot closer to time at this point. But Diogo has taken the first knockout, so it's definitely in the advantageous position at this point, especially with the Necrozma and the Zapdos still on the field. And wow, Quick Guard coming out from that Zapdos, putting stop to any Fake Outs coming out from the Incineroar.
Yeah, nice little piece of tech here, and the Urshifu protecting, not hiding behind a substitute, is going to take that Photon Geyser. Is going to stick around, but there's still a lot of damage being done, especially heading into an end game. But in return, Incineroar going to fire off a Flare Blitz into the Necrozma. All of the damage coming out this time around. Quick Guard, of course, going to be essentially useless, as neither Pokemon went for anything speedy. Instead, just looking to tank the hits and return the damage. And this Necrozma, which has been so pesky out on the field, is finally going to go down. And I mean, the whole pace of this match has been fairly slow, but the timer comes out and these Pokemon are taking KOs.
Yeah, now we're down to 2 minutes, so you do need to be picking up as many knockouts as you can. We're down to an even 3 at the moment, so we'll have to see if either player is able to take that advantage. I don't think we're going to be able to get down to all 4 Pokemon knocked out at this point, so it's almost certainly going to come down to the timer. So a little bit of a missed opportunity from Diogo there. The double up into the Necrozma could have left the Zapdos completely open to be able to go for something like a close combat into the Incineroar or the Brave Bird into the Urshifu. That would have picked up a knockout on either of those Pokemon. So a very strong play from Rajan, being able to double up into that Necrozma, ignoring the quick guards, so not going for any of the fake outs either. But now you still got to break through this Urshifu, this Zapdos and the Amoonguss as well, and you're not going to be able to do that if you go for a Protect.
Yeah, at least it means you're not going to be slept by this Amoonguss then, going for this for Zapdos, firing off a close combat though, and I mean, we saw the Defiant Boost that activated earlier. This Zapdos is strong, it is furious, critical hit to boot, that one's not going to matter at this point, but Incineroar is going to be going down as we have that countdown on screen.
Yeah, and actually the Black Sludge coming into play for Amoonguss there. That means that the timer is actually going to be put down below the 45 seconds. So with that slight extra bit of animation, may have just tipped the edge. If you survive in with 46 seconds left, then you'd be okay. But actually, of course, the Rillaboom having to set up that grassy terrain once again, wasting all of these seconds and needing at least 46 of them, because now at this point, Diogo has the Pokemon advantage, doesn't need to input any moves at all, just needs to wait out that timer, and they have a guaranteed win condition at this point because they have 3 Pokemon against the opposing 2. You could probably pick up the knockouts on both of these Pokemon at this point. You click a Brave Bird, something is being KO'd, whether that's the Rillaboom or the Urshifu. So even if you take out the Zapdos, the Urshifu gets spored as well. So even though the timer was going to take it for Diogo there, still very much pinned.
Oh, for sure. But I mean, it was still a well-fought battle, considering it was almost an unfair fight, considering Diogo had use of the restricted, was able to utilize it, and Rajan didn't really get to the Zacian being taken out right away in the first match. In the second match, getting burned on the swap in. But Rajan, I mean, everything he could with the remaining 3 Pokemon. I've seen Urshifu, Rillaboom, and Incineroar be able to pull off some nasty things. Just the 3 of them by themselves are so strong, but unable to be breaking through that Necrozma till right at the end, unable to break through that Amoonguss. And, I mean, Diogo's going to be taking this in a 2-0.
You know, it's interesting seeing the Zapdos as well come in right at the end of both of those games and effectively just winning it for Diogo pretty much from there. Didn't hit the field for multiple turns in both of them. Right at the end, there was like 1 turn where it hit the field and was able to take the game. And then it was able to just get 2 knockouts really easily with those close combats as well. Did manage to get intimidated both times as well from the Incineroar. So it was just a really, really slow, grindy game with all the switches out. With the Incineroar, Urshifu, and Rillaboom, of course, they like to switch out a lot between the 3 of them. And then there was the Amoonguss getting the Regenerator going. You've got the Incineroar, of course. The Necrozma mostly stayed on the field for as long as it wanted, but occasionally swapping out. And then the Zapdos just hits the field and cleans up the rest of the game.
Yeah, and going for a pivot-heavy game, I mean, if you can get yourself in position and catch your opponent out of position can be so strong, but Rajan unable to find footing, of course, the Zacian on the swap-in. It's a double swap that turn, and unfortunately that slot fell due to a Flare Blitz, and I feel like that was such a defining moment in the match because, I mean, what was a very pivoty game was all of a sudden this restricted being almost useless, and, I mean, from that point, you're just trying to catch up.
Yeah, so that was definitely a different pace game from the previous ones we have shown you. Much more fast-paced in the first 3, a little bit more grindy in that 4th one. So we'll have to see what is going to be the case for this 5th and final game, which we are going to be showing you very shortly. Of course, we are going to cut to a very short break, and we will be right back with that final game between Malaysia and the United States.